from understanding how to use really basic molecular biology techniques to answer research questions. That was kind of my undergrad years. And then during graduate school, continuing to use those basic techniques, but applying them in kind of whole animal physiology models. And I was going to be able to continue doing that in his lab. He was interested in my immunology background because he studied a virus that causes obesity.
Oh.
But he also did work with this particular fatty acid that I've been studying called CLA, but looking at its effects on obesity. And he was, it just so happens about the time I started in his lab, he got grant funding to do a clinical trial. So studying the effects of that fatty acid in humans using a weight loss protocol. And so that's where I ended up going for my first postdoc fellowship, was working with him. And that's really how I got started doing obesity research. And I just really loved the field. I felt like this was where my passion was really what I wanted to focus on. And so that's kind of how I shaped my career at that point. And I had a series of other training, postdoctoral training, where I continued to work with him, but also with other people. Then I ended up with a job in a clinical department. This was all still in Madison, Wisconsin, where I studied. There was a clinician there who was really interested in how obesity affects women's health, and especially women's fertility, because he does a lot of treatment work with fertility. So I got to study a particular metabolic disorder in women called polycystic ovary syndrome, and designed a study to kind of look at the energetics, what happens in women with PCOS differently from women with PCOS, and does obesity influence that? And so I got to learn some really cool techniques that are important in human research in obesity during that time. But that was all of these jobs since graduate school through this time were all funded through grant, which is pretty typical when you're in kind of that early career postdoctoral fellowship time. But it's very tenuous. You still have a job as long as you're bringing in grant money. That's not super stable, and it's a stressful, kind of exhausting way to live your life. So
I can imagine.
the whole time I was still applying for, what in my head seemed like real jobs. I mean, those were real jobs that have more of a permanent, long-term position nature to them. And I had several job offers that, for various reasons, didn't feel like the right fit. I didn't accept them. But then I got an offer with the USDA. And so U.S. Department of Agriculture has an internal research arm called the Agricultural Research Service. And within that Agricultural Research Service, they study all kinds of things, from forestry to animal science to crop science. But nutrition is one of the big arms within the Agricultural Research Service. Mm-hmm. And they have human nutrition research centers, 6 of them throughout the country. And I applied. There were job openings in 2 of those where the job focused on obesity. And so I applied to those positions, and I ended up accepting a position working at the Human Nutrition Research Center that's in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Most people don't even know it exists there, but it had been there for over 30 years by the time I joined them. Really well-established research center that had been focused on trace mineral research and nutrition, but had just a year or 2 before I went there had switched to focus on obesity. So they were looking for new obesity scientist positions. And so I got hired there and was put into a position of lead scientist over, with a team of other scientists to run a research program there. So I got to do some really cool experiments there because it was the most well-equipped research facility I'd ever been in with regards to the staff and the facilities and the equipment and so forth. But the leadership there was really toxic. I wasted a good 50% of my time most days, more than that on some days. just dealing with politics and people who were upset because the center director had done something horrible. And so anyway, it became clear that it was going to be hard for me to be really successful there, because I was going to have to pour so much energy into all the nonsense that was caused by poor leadership, which is unfortunate, but it's good to recognize it happens in life, and
Yeah.
and sometimes you have to make your career decisions based on that. So I didn't have to leave that job, but I told myself I was going to keep my mind open. My kids were also at an age where if we were going to relocate, I would rather do it then than later. They were both kind of early preschool and early elementary school during those years that we were in North Dakota. So it was a great place to live, great people to work with, but really toxic environment. So I said, I'll just keep my mind open in case other opportunities come up. But I wasn't like urgently looking for another job. But as chance would have it, a recruiter called me a few months after I had kind of come to this realization and said, hey, I have this job in El Paso. We'd like you to interview for it. You know, one of your colleagues highly recommended you. I listened to the job, and here I am doing all this, mostly now human research study types of research questions. I wasn't doing as much in animals anymore. It was much more at the clinical research level or human subjects research level. And what this person was asking me to apply for was a job that would be in charge of changing the prevalence of obesity across the whole region, which requires understanding the individual level of obesity, you know, for humans, of course, but actually required skills that I didn't have training in and was, you know, beyond what I had ever formally studied or had experience with. But I had been involved with a national organization since my first postdoc fellowship called the Obesity Society. And at their annual conference, they cover all aspects of obesity. So they have scientific presentations on, you know, molecular mechanisms of obesity and the latest research in that area, on human studies research, on clinical treatment of obesity, but also on things like community-based strategies to address obesity at a population level, or public health strategies for obesity, policy-based work focused on obesity. So because of that exposure through this national organization and interacting with colleagues more broadly and globally in the field of obesity, I was able to put forward my thoughts about how you would address obesity on a regional level, apparently in a convincing enough way that the search committee offered me the job. So I came to El Paso to start this new research center with kind of this underlying focus of addressing obesity regionally in the Paso del Norte region. And have you heard the Paso del Norte Health Foundation?
I have. Not until I looked you up a little bit, but yeah.
Someone there sent you to, didn't they?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that's right. So, so before I go to this next part, have I said anything that you have questions about? Sorry, it was kind of a long rant.
No, I loved it. It's like super informative, and you're like answering all my questions along the way, so it's perfect. Yeah.
Our foundation is a private foundation that was created when a local hospital was sold. A public local hospital was sold to a private entity, and this commonly happens. I didn't know this at the time. I learned all about this world of foundations. It's a whole world in and of itself after I moved here. So I'm just kind of giving you a quick synopsis here. But what will often happen is it's can be referred to as a conversion foundation. So it's when public entity is sold to a private entity, then, you know, it's I don't know, there's probably legal ramifications, but also just what's considered good practice is to take the proceeds of that sale and do something good for the community, right? Because in this case, this hospital that was publicly owned had a lot of public investment in it. And so by selling it to a private company that was now going to take over running it, but, you know, they're now on their own. They're going to make a profit, and that's how they're going to keep it afloat. What are we going to do with that money that essentially the public should get the benefits from that sale because it was all publicly owned? So one, I really don't know a whole lot about this. I just know it happened in the case of the foundation. So what they did was the money was invested, and they set up a foundation with a board of directors and everything to oversee it that would use the proceeds of those investments. So the money that comes, and it's all regulated through tax codes, and it's a whole complex world in and of itself that I won't bore you with the details, and I don't know most of the details, but they get special tax exempt status, if they use that money, in a responsible way to help the community. So there's foundations like this all over the world. This is just one, and this is one type of foundation.
Right.
So in this case, the founding members of the board decided that they would focus on health promotion and disease prevention. Having been money that came from a hospital, they kind of decided, hey, why don't we try and take this money to help our community not need hospitals so much? How can we keep people from developing diseases in the first place?
Right.
So that's kind of the broad premise of the Paso del Norte Health Foundation. And I don't think that's at all what your paper is about, but I just wanted you to kind of understand where the funding for the start of this center came from.
Right.
So what they were doing at that time, so this was 10, 12 years ago, they were starting to use a model that has been described for solving complex problems at like a community or population level. And the model is called collective impact model. And if you want me to send you a citation or a reference about that, you can also just Google collective impact. Lots of papers and so forth on it.
Right.
There's a paper from, I want to say it's 2011 or 12. Stanford Review is the name of the journal. Stanford Review something or other is the name of the journal. And it talks about this model. Collective impact means that by using this model, you are more likely to coordinate efforts and drive bigger impact and a more sustainable impact than if you don't use this model, which happens in most communities. You've got people who are maybe trying to do similar types of things, and they're kind of all good intent and they're out there doing good work. But when it's not coordinated, it's less likely to have as much impact. So you have smaller isolated impacts instead of collective.
Right.
And the model for collective impact says that if you have 5 components, you're more likely to drive collective impact. And one of those 5 components is the backbone or organization that ensures coordination and making sure that those 5 components are all working together. So at the time, and the other components of collective impact model are to have a common agenda, which means partners who all have a similar goal agree upon what's our agenda, what are we trying to accomplish, so that they're working towards shared goals. So a common agenda, continuous communication, mutually reinforcing activities, and then a shared measurement system. It sounds kind of obvious, but it gets missed a lot in this kind of work, that we don't measure if we're having an impact, or we don't measure it well, or we measure it in a dozen different ways that are like comparing apples to oranges.
Right.
So a shared measurement system for collective impact model can be really powerful, because you can't determine if you're successfully reaching the goals of your common agenda if you're not sussing it. If you're not measuring, okay, this program was intended to have this impact. We don't measure change in that particular outcome that we're interested in. We don't know if we're having that impact.
Exactly.
Well, we don't. So by measuring it, we can tell, is it working, is it not working? And usually it works a little, but maybe not really well. And then you can figure out from other evaluation data how to improve it even better. So that shared measurement system is important, because if you now have a dozen partners who all have some shared goal, one of the goals in our common agenda was to increase fruit and vegetable intake throughout the region. And it's a really common, popular goal to like a lot of community organizations like to target that for various reasons. I'm sure you know of community programs that try and get people to eat more fruits and vegetables.
Right.
But if we measure fruits and vegetables, there's lots of ways you can measure. Did a certain program or a certain policy or some other kind of change in the community change fruit and vegetable intake? You can measure it so many different ways. But the problem is if you measure it all those different ways, you might not, you almost always can't compare them. So if what you're trying to do is find out, okay, we have 6 organizations during this year that are doing programs to increase fruit and vegetable intake, and they all 6 measure it in a different way. One uses a 24-hour recall of the participants where you sit them down and you say, tell me what you ate for the last 24 hours. And another uses something called a food frequency questionnaire, which is a survey type of tool that says, how often did you eat apples in the last week, in the last month, in the last year? How often did you eat carrots in the last week, in the last month? So food frequency questionnaires are often used because they're easy, but you can imagine they're not very accurate.
No.
Can you accurately tell me how frequently you ate something a month ago and 6 months ago? And,
No.
I mean, it's almost ridiculous. You don't have to be a nutrition scientist or an assessment specialist to know it's ridiculous to think that kind of tool is going to be very useful. So we've got this problem with shared measurement systems that oftentimes the work we're doing is hard to assess. And if we're using different tools, one group has people write down what they eat for 3 days, which is called a 3-day diet record. Another group does a 24-hour recall. Another group does a food frequency questionnaire. You cannot compare those to each other. So if you see a change in something, you can't really know, is it truly changing to which you can't say this group had a greater impact than this group. This program worked better than this program because you're comparing tools that aren't measuring the same thing. So, and then on top of that, for this work, it's in nutrition and physical activity work, it's really hard to accurately assess anyway if you're using self-report, which most community organizations do. And then most community organizations don't even use more standard tools from the research field. They just make up their own survey questions and ask people, and then they report on that. So the science of the assessment of the measurement is really poor typically in community settings. It's not a criticism of those community organizations. It's based on the resources and the knowledge and the skills. So going back to the Health Foundation, they have initiative areas in various different types of health. Like at that time, they were working in like smoking and tobacco and vaping, alcohol abuse, mental health. And then ever since they were first founded, they had something going on with regards to healthy eating and or nutrition and physical activity, active living. How they packaged that had varied over the years, but they decided to bring it together under one initiative that was administered, as one initiative called Healthy Eating, Active Living, or HEAL, HEAL. And so what they wanted to do was to apply collective impact to healthy eating, active living in the region, with the goal of impacting obesity. So they had a little bit of a misperception there that we can talk about more with regards to obesity and thinking that obesity is just about nutrition and physical activity. It absolutely is not. And I was able to start to work on their perceptions about that during the interview process and look into it and so forth. So I was able to bring that forward in our strategic planning when we started our research center. But so I was basically hired to start a center that would serve as the backbone organization for the HEAL initiative of the Paso del Norte Health Foundation. That's what brought me to El Paso. So I was the founding executive director of that center. It was a partnership. It was funded by the Health Foundation. The way the Health Foundation goes about getting things like this started is they will put out an announcement called a request for applications. And in that application, they said, we want someone to start a center, we'll do this. And whoever responds to that with a proposal that meets the expectations of the foundation, then they can get a grant to do it. And the response to that request for applications came from a partnership of universities, including UTEP, Texas Tech, and UT Health Science Center School of Public Health. And so you're at UTEP, you know what UTEP is. I'm guessing you know about Texas Tech here in El Paso. You know, it's medical school, nursing school, dental school, and so forth.
Yeah.
So Texas Tech Health Science Center. And then UT Health Science Center is UT Health Science Center at Houston is the official full name, because there's actually UT Health Science Center in San Antonio as well. And there might be one or two other ones, but UT Health at Houston is a large university based in Houston that has a medical school, a dental school, biomedical informatics school. I think there's one I'm forgetting, and a school of public health. And their school of public health is like the top ranking school of public health in Texas. And it's one of the top, I forget, handful in the whole country.
Oh, wow.
And so the UT Health School of Public Health has 6 campuses, because a long time there, the university itself is over 50 years old now, I believe. But several decades ago, the leadership started to recognize if we're really going to do a good job with public health, we need faculty doing research in all parts of the state. So they started establishing campuses. And the campus in El Paso was established 30 years ago. That's how long we've been here now.
Oh, wow.
So we're located in the Cardwell Collaborative, and we've been there for 3 years. That's the building where Medical Center of the Americas is located. I don't know if you're familiar with the building.
No.
It's right off of I-10. So if you drive along I-10, you've probably passed it, every single time you drive on I-10. It's a big-ish, it's not super huge building. It's only 3 stories, but it's got glass all along one side that faces the interstate. So when it first got built, maybe 10 years ago or so, it was kind of noticeable, because it's a really pretty building right along the interstate. And it's at the Reynolds exit. So kind of the same place you exit if you're going to Texas Tech or UMC, it's that same exit, but it's right on the interstate, so you can see it as well. So that's where we're located now. Previously, we were located in space owned by UT, because we're all part of the UT system, and the Board of Regents had said, hey, you guys should just share space. But now we're in a separate space. So I think that co-location with UTEP caused most people to be confused that UT Health was just part of UTEP. It's not, it's a separate university. But
Right.
So this initial partnership to apply for the funds to get the center started was a 3-way partnership, UTEP, Texas Tech, and UT Health. But the Health Foundation said they wanted the administration of the grant to happen through UTEP. So when I was first hired, I was a UTEP employee, and we were administratively managed through UTEP, but we were physically located in Office Space, Texas, because that's where the foundation wanted us to look. And then it's kind of a long, complex story, but over the course of about 5-6 years, I got the center built. We were doing really well, but there were leadership decisions at the high level at UTEP that were kind of keeping the center from being able to kind of pass a certain ceiling, just because of the way that the funding was being managed and the way the integration into the university was happening. Right. So I made a strategic decision to move the center from UTEP to UT Health. So now we're administered under the UT Health umbrella. So now my faculty appointment, which used to be at UTEP, is now at UT Health.
Okay.
So I've had a professor title at both of those schools, but I'm currently at UT Health. But the purpose of our center is still the same, to impact obesity throughout the region. A lot of that work focuses on healthy eating and active living. But what's important, and we still use the collective impact model, but unfortunately, the Health Foundation and this is common in foundations too, where they'll kind of focus on something for a few years and then their attention gets pulled somewhere else. So their attention has been pulled away from collective impact model. So they no longer fund backbone organizations. And that's true across all their different initiative areas. They used to have a backbone for alcohol. They used to have a backbone for smoking, mental health, and so forth. And they're kind of not really, I'm not capturing this very accurately. So don't try and use how I'm describing it to say this is the foundation's intent. I mean, if you really want to cover the foundation funding, you should interview program leadership, like their VP for program at the foundation. But I'm just describing it briefly so you kind of understand that it's still my intent to address obesity regionally, and the collective impact model is an effective way to do that. It's a really tricky model to implement, though, if you don't have that core kind of funding, like the foundation provided to get us started. So using collective impact is different than what a lot of academic research centers do. Most academic research centers focus on research questions and research grants. So they'll just have these discrete projects that may be very powerful, very meaningful projects, but they may not plug into a larger coordinated effort, which is what collective impact model does. So what I'm trying to perpetuate here and continue to grow is an academic research center that uses collective impact model, but it is really challenging to do that. The way universities and funding mechanisms are set up makes it really difficult to do that. But that's kind of probably beyond the scope of your paper. I just wanted you to have sort of an understanding of what makes our center a little different than traditional research centers at universities. So I continue to work on this big picture goal of impacting obesity. We do have, the restructuring, moving from UTEP to UT Health meant that things were up in the air for a while. Some of my staff needed, because it was all funded through grants and we weren't quite sure what was going to happen with grant funding, some of those staff had to, consider career changes. And a big part of my team was graduate students who have now finished their graduate work and moved on and so forth. So we've had, how we look today is a lot different than how we looked 3 years ago or 4 years ago. Plus we had the pandemic hit, of course, which makes everything different. But we've had our work continue that whole time. But our team looks different, the makeup of our team, and I'm in the process of rebuilding it. So by switching to UT Health, one of the biggest advantages is that I got commitment from the university to hire additional professors to be part of the research center. And that's a big thing I could not convince UTEP leadership to do. They weren't even paying me as a professor. I was paying my own salary off of the grant money that I had gotten. And that was part of the problem. I couldn't keep paying my salary off of grant money. I needed to get paid by the university for the teaching and the administrative work and mentoring of graduate students and so forth. And nobody at UTEP was figuring out how to make that happen. So now I get paid by the university. I also get paid by research grants. That's pretty typical in a university setting, that faculty are expected to cover part of their funding from grants, and then part comes from the university, which is, in our case, state money. And I'm in the process of hiring additional faculty to join our team, so more professors, which will help us, of course, expand our impact and the capacity of work that we can do. With that same focus of big picture, addressing obesity, but really focusing on what the community needs. So that's another thing that often happens with academic research is you've got researchers. To be successful in academia, you need to build your research profile. So you go from one project, you answer the questions of that project, but that typically creates like a dozen new questions that need to be answered. So you build your next research projects like that.
Okay.
Completely understandable, because that's how you get grants. And grants are a big part of being successful if you're a scientist at a university. What I was able to do, because we had this large grant from the Health Foundation, just to give you a sense, over the course of the first about 6 years of our existence, including about a year before